Good evening to all. Today I'll be discussing among the atherosclerotic risk factors, systemic hypertension. Already the other risk factors have been dealt with, which include diabetes and atherosclerosis, diabetes and smoking. And today we'll be dealing with systemic hypertension. For the most part, I've tried to make this as much correlated to the atherosclerotic burden of disease that we see rather than make it a pedantic discussion only on systemic hypertension. But I may end up veering to some pure hypertensive discussion, and for that, do forgive me. I will be dealing with the topic under the following headings. Basically, from the epidemiology, then its association with cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis. Its features are diagnostic approach towards the same, secondary causes, and pathological mechanisms and effects. Then we'll be delving into the treatment and the guidelines associated with the same, and then a word about renal artery hypertension. Generally, the US statistics as well as the Indian statistics show a significant overlap. Among the US statistics, the general age-adjusted prevalence in an adult age group is said to be around 29.1%. And the prevalence increases with age, and it's seen to be increased in racial predilection towards blacks and reduced towards Hispanic and non-Hispanic Asians. Among Indian statistics, of course, there is no such racial variance which has been looked at, but there is a significant difference which has been noted in the rural and urban settings, which I'll be coming to, and no difference noted between the sexes. These deal with the US statistics, which Rutherford deals with, where it shows for example, a clear ratio, age-based increase in the incidence of hypertension based on the age, and an increase in the blacks and a reduction compared to white population. This is a study which has been published in the Journal of Hypertension, which looks at the prevalence of hypertension in India. This has looked at multiple different studies done, and it's a meta-analysis which looked at close to on a total almost 81,000 hypertensive patients from both rural and urban population, as well as the different regions, whether North, East, West, or South India. In general, these have found that there is only a significant difference between rural and urban population based on p-value, but in the western part of the country. But among the rest of the country, it's more or less. Although this diagram may show a difference between the prevalence, there is no significant p-value difference between rural and urban populations in the incidence of hypertension. And these show the number of participants which have been looked at in each of these series. Among the same, there is a significant difference in the awareness as well as the treatment. This is again a similar pattern which is seen in Western and Indian populations, where maybe about 25% of the patients among rural populations are aware of their own hypertensive diagnosis. Similarly, 25% may be getting treated, and only 10% may have the BP under control despite being treated. In an urban population, 42% may have a general awareness of their diagnosis, while only 38% end up getting treated, and again only 20% end up getting adequately treated. Why we have to keep dealing with hypertension is that in a majority of patients where atherosclerotic burden, atherosclerotic peripheral arterial disease, or cellular disease ends up being there, hypertension is often significantly present as an associated comorbid illness. And based on multiple studies, whether it's the Framingham Heart Study, which is the most comprehensive and long-lasting study, which has now been going on since 40 years and still ongoing, or the National Health and Nutrition and Evaluation Services, all of these show that the hypertension is associated with a higher incidence of cardiovascular disease with MI, stroke, and death. Less than 50 years, according to the Framingham Heart Study, shows that diastolic blood pressure has a stronger predictor. 50 to 59 years shows no particular value showing a increased predisposition, while more than 60 years, the systolic blood pressure shows a higher prediction towards comorbid illnesses. Generally, as I mentioned with the Public Health Foundation of India study, which is what I described earlier. Even the American NHANES shows that among all the patients, only 82.7% of the patients may be aware, 75.6% of them may be under treatment, and 51.8% may have it under control. The association of hypertension with peripheral arterial disease has in all of these studies they have been looking at the association of comorbid illnesses and eventual morbidity and eventual outcome. Some of these studies define peripheral arterial disease as patients who have intermittent claudication. Some have proceed with a diagnosis of peripheral arterial disease based on ABI of less than 0.9. Regardless of the definition, there is a significant association of hypertension associated with PAD, with a 2.2 odds ratio of hypertension associated with PAD in the Framingham Heart Study. The NHANE is also having similar results. And studies which look at ABPI alone rather than looking at intermittent claudication include the NHANES cardiovascular health study and the Rotterdam study of PAD. All of these show that the pressure is more consistent with disease, as the presence of peripheral arterial disease. Generally, hypertension, majority of patients may be asymptomatic. When symptomatic, these are associated with either cerebrovascular manifestations or cardiac manifestations. With accelerated hypertension, there may be headache, visual disturbances, or severe headache which may, with a neurological episode, which may indicate a hemorrhagic stroke, or an acute CV if there is an ischemic stroke which occurs. Cardiac cardiac events may include left ventricular failure, arrhythmias, congestive heart failure, and MI, and hypertensive emergencies with widespread end organ damage in the kidneys, in the retinae, and the various other vascular beds. This is again looking at the association with lower extremity arterial disease, comparing all the other risk factors, and noting that hypertension has close to a 2 of an odds ratio compared to all the other risk factors which have been seen. How do we diagnose that a patient may come with hypertension, whether they're symptomatic or asymptomatic? The definition of hypertension as per the JNC 7, the Joint National Committee report for hypertension, the latest JNC report is the JNC 8 in 2014. That does not define the classification defining hypertension, while it instead talks about the treatment goals. And so we will deal with it when we come to the treatment. Normal hypertension is considered to be a systolic less than 120, diastolic less than 80, pre-hypertension between 120 to 140, 139, and diastolic between 80 to 89, stage 1 between 140 to 159 of systolic and 90 to 99 of diastolic. Stage 2 is more than equal to 160 of systolic and more than 100 of diastolic. Among the pediatric population, again, this will vary. So the each age group has a varying percentile. And other than go into the very confusing numbers and the various tables which may be associated with each age group, I would just like to highlight the following points. A normal blood pressure based on age and height of a child will be considered to be less than the 90th percentile appropriate to that age and height. Prehypertension is considered to be between the 90th and 95th percentile, or if it is more than 120 by 80, independent of what the 90th percentile value is. The stage 1 hypertension is when the values lie between the 95th and 99th percentile, and stage 2 hypertension when it is more than the 99th percentile plus 5 millimeters of mercury. This is just to give an example as to why it can get very confusing. So looking at everything from the first stage, at each height there might be a 90th percentile which would be considered normal of the blood pressure. Similarly, at age 5, you can see that it goes up to 112. And rather than confuse matters, this is an updated definition which looks at 1 to 13 years and more than 13 years. Where the 1 to 13 years, as I mentioned, follows the same principles as before, where you'll have to follow the table, where it's been a little more clearly defined in more than 13 years, where stage 1 hypertension is between 130 to 139 of systolic and 80 to 89 of diastolic. than 140/90. And these, because the patients who may come with hypertension may be in the pediatric age group as well. So this is also something which we'll need to keep in mind when we are approaching these patients. The technique of blood pressure measurement is quite standardized. An average of at least 2 readings, at each over 2 visits, at least a week apart. With the patient in the sitting position with the back rested, after having been at least 5 minutes in a quiet room, checked at the arm at the level of the heart, with a cuff at least covering 80% of the circumference of the arm. And the patient should be free of caffeine or smoking at least 30 minutes prior to measurement. There is a role for ambulatory BP measurement in situations where either a masked hypertension is suspected, a white coat hypertension with patients who may seem very anxious, and defined as an elevated single reading more than 140/90, but an ambulatory reading less than 130/80. Resistant hypertension to confirm the diagnosis, which is defined as uncontrolled hypertension despite being on 3 or more drugs with maximal dosage. And other indications would include episodic hypertension, autonomic dysfunction, or orthostasis. And the hypertension definition on ambulatory BPM measurement is different, where a 24-hour average more than 130/80 or a daytime average more than 140/85 is sufficient to diagnose these. How it is done is it requires, of course, 24-hour measurements with this apparatus, and it remains with the patient, and at the end of the measurement duration, an average is taken, and we come to the conclusion. And finally, the secondary causes of hypertension which have to be kept in mind. These may vary according to the age group, and rather than go into the specifics of this, I'll just like to broadly deal with them as per here. One important secondary cause which is not mentioned here is chronic kidney disease. So established renal disease. Among the others, renal artery stenosis and coarctation are the vascular causes. Endocrine causes would include thyrotoxicosis, hyperaldosteronism, pheochromocytoma, and Cushing's syndrome. Various other causes may include obstructive sleep apnea or drug-induced hypertension, which may be either various herbal medications, NSAIDs, or steroids. And important indicators in each of these settings would be importantly hypokalemia for hyperaldosteronism, the symptoms of thyrotoxicosis for thyroid dysfunction, and in coarctation of aorta, any radiofemoral delay or obvious difference in blood pressure. And of course, all bruits and peripheral pulses also need to be checked, because this may indicate either a residual atherosclerotic disease or a delay of the pulse, or a discordance between the radial and the femoral pulses may indicate a coarctation of aorta. Important to look for would be a renal artery bruit in patients for renal artery stenosis. The renal artery hypertension is something I would just like to briefly touch over. Among varying patients, close to about 33% of patients who are coming with PAD may end up having renal artery stenosis, among which 9 may be significant, which is more than 60%. And why this needs to be considered as a different entity is that the end organ severe and essential hypertension. And this is often because the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, a system which I'll be coming to subsequently, has multiple effects, and persistent elevation in a diseased kidney, especially in renovascular disease, so hyperperfusion leading to renin released by the juxtaglomerular cells, leads to the stimulation of this cascade. This cascade causes irreversible changes in the structures of the heart as well as the peripheral vasculature, which may lead to a more permanent set of changes, which may or may not be reversed. And based on, so these are multiple studies which are looking at these high-risk groups, and all of these show a varying incidence of percentage of renal artery stenosis. And this is important to know because there is no general prevalence in the general population as to what the incidence of renal artery stenosis is. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which is very important for us to understand the approach to hypertension in the pathogenesis as well as the treatment, generally starts with the release of renin because any cause of hypoperfusion of the kidney. This converts the angiotensin released in the liver to angiotensin 1, which subsequently is converted in the lungs by the ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, to angiotensin 2. The angiotensin 2 is among the most potent vasoconstricting agents in the blood. And the other effect of angiotensin 2, which also contributes to an increase in the blood pressure, is it stimulates the release of aldosterone, which causes fluid retention, sodium and fluid retention in the kidneys, again causing a volume surplus, leading to hypertension. Now, an important thing to note, and why we probably the crux of the presentation for us today, is the pathological mechanisms associated with associating hypertension with atherosclerosis. And what is important to note is, although there is an association found in multiple studies, in multiple general population studies, there is a consistent association found where hypertension is associated with PAD, but there is no molecular basis which has been established for the same. Animal studies are not consistent because these mouse models sometimes show that hypertension may cause an increase in the atherosclerotic lesion size. But again, the reduction of BP doesn't result in the reduction of the lesion size. I mean, different studies show different results in these animal models. The association of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system with atherosclerosis has also been studied. Here, angiotensin infusion has been tested in mouse models, and these have been seen to promote atherosclerosis. And the same mouse models have also shown an inhibition of the RAAS reduces the incidence of atherosclerosis. But in humans, the same incidence has not been associated. Here, it has been found that increased hypercholesterolemia may increase angiotensin 1 receptor expression, angiotensin receptor 1 expression. And this may support the use of statins with AC therapy, because control of cholesterolemia will also lead to reduced receptor expression, leading to better BP control. And statins by themselves will improve vascular elasticity and endothelial function. But there is no consistent association with associating even the RAS with an increased atherosclerosis. And finally, there have been studies looking at the association of endothelial dysfunction with hypertension. In coronary, renal, and some studies of peripheral circulations, it has been shown that hypertension is associated with endothelial dysfunction, and this has been hypothesized. Of course, it's one of the initiating factors in the start of an atherosclerotic lesion. But there have been studies which look and see if endothelial dysfunction is the primary stimulating the onset of hypertension. And the hypothesis is that nitric oxide reduction following endothelial dysfunction will lead to reduced vascular reactivity, leading to increased hypertension, but this is not proven. We'll come to the management of hypertension now. And rather than making this very drug-based or very medical, I'll try to bring as much of the general applicability for our practice and the trials associated with the same. Multiple studies have shown that overall outcomes there's a significant reduction in cardiovascular risk and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease outcomes in patients with adequate BP control in patients who have PAD. A HOPE study has looked at ramipril, and this shows significant reduction of the cardiovascular risk in PAD patients. And the appropriate blood pressure control study, the ABCD study, also showed that a mean of 128 to 75 is preferred to reduce morbidity. The UK prospective diabetes study group showed no reduction in the risk of PAD caused due to control in hypertension, but an improvement in the cardiovascular disease outcomes. The ACC and AHA guidelines have all showed that reduction to blood pressure values less than 140/90 results in a reduction in the cardiovascular risk associated with hypertension. JNC guidelines, which I'll be coming to shortly and be discussing in detail, describe that in more than 60 years, an ideal value of the blood pressure, target blood pressure value would be less than 150/90. And less than 60 years, a value less than 140/90 is sufficient. Probably because some elderly patients more than 60 years may have increased incidence of isolated systolic hypertension without elevated diastolic blood pressure. This SPRINT study is also interesting because it looks at comparison of control less than 140 versus a control less than 120. And it was a randomized control trial. And this interestingly found that there is a reduction in the fatal and non-fatal cardiovascular events if the BP is reduced to less than 120. But some issues with the study are that it excluded any patients less than 50 years, any patients with CVA or patients with diabetes, and which would include a substantial portion of the patients who will come with hypertension. The general principles are that the reduction of BP reduces cardiovascular adverse outcomes, and these benefits are also noted in peripheral arterial disease patients. In general, pre-hypertension patients suffice with lifestyle modification alone, and in patients who have stage 1 or stage 2 hypertension, lifestyle modification is always a first approach. If there is definite end organ damage or no improvement with lifestyle modification, then medications can be started immediately. And patients with more than 160 by 100, dual antihypertensives will be started immediately. The lifestyle changes include smoking cessation, control of and lipids, dietary control, which one important dietary followed diet is the dietary approaches to stop hypertension diet, which emphasizes increased fiber-rich diet, increased fruits and vegetables, reduction in the salt intake, and lean proteins. And this has been found to have significant reduction in the incidence of control of hypertension. And physical activity with at least 3 to 4 days a week of exercise, about 40 minutes a session. Interestingly, a weight reduction has been found to be significant predictor of reduction in cardiovascular events and the control of hypertension. It has been mentioned that 1 kg weight loss reduces the blood pressure by 2 millimeters of mercury, and each 2 millimeter reduction of 2 millimeter mercury reduction in the blood pressure reduces the incidence of CVA by 15% and the incidence of MI by 8%. And these are all things to be noted, and these form an important cornerstone in the advice that we give to patients in terms of lifestyle modifications, following their advice in controls of sugars, lipids, and weight reduction and exercise. As I mentioned earlier, there are multiple strategies which can be used. One strategy, which is the strategy A, includes starting one drug, titrate to a maximum, then start a second drug. The strategy B, which is starting one drug, adding a second one before the maximal dose of the first drug is reached, and then titrate accordingly. And the third strategy, which involves starting 2 drugs initially itself. This is generally advised on the BP to begin with is more than 160 by 100. The initial drugs of choice include thiazide diuretics, AC inhibitors or ARBs, or calcium channel blockers. And the second drug often is chosen based on the comorbid illnesses which may be there with the patient. So various drugs are found to have different incidence of different advantages in patient groups. So any patients with congestive heart failure or coronary artery disease benefit from loop diuretics, AC inhibitors, as well as beta blockers. CKD patients and diabetic patients significantly benefit from AC inhibitors or ARBs. This is the overall approach to the JNC hypertension guidance. I'll be dealing with them in 2 parts subsequently. Generally, the approach is any patients who come with an elevated blood pressure, either they need to be classified as to whether they are diabetic or CKD patients or in general population. If these patients have a diabetes or CKD, in the absence of CKD with diabetes alone, a BP goal is considered to be 140 by 90. With CKD present with or without diabetes, AC inhibitors or ARBs alone or with another class are started immediately. With patients in the general population, target of with patients more than 60 years, a target of 150/90 said to be sufficient. Less than 60 years, a target of 140/90 said to be sufficient. There has been a significant difference associated in the African American population versus the non-African American population. Mainly that the African Americans the initial drug of choice would be either thiazides or calcium channel blockers alone or in combination. And for non-black populations, thiazide inhibitors or ARBs. The addition here would be AC inhibitors or ARBs along with the others. Now, at each stage now, which I'll be dealing with again, we have to check whether the BP goal is attained. If it's not attained, whether the compliance is adequate, reinforcing the previous advice, and if titration is achieved. If titration is not achieved, whether another drug is required, and till a maximum of 3 drugs, all titrated to the maximum dose can be added. And if there is no control despite the same, then referral to a hypertension specialist has been advised. I'll be now going into a brief overview of the drugs which are used for the treatment here. Thiazide diuretics act on the distal convoluted tubule. They are effective in patients with a low renin level, and definitely it's been why it has come to be used as a first choice is because of this trial called the ALL-HAT trial. These are multiple adverse effects which include hypokalemia, hyperuricemia, insulin resistance, and can be associated with erectile dysfunction. And patients who have renal stones due to hypercalciuria may benefit from the same because it causes decreased calcium in the urine, and therefore it's beneficial for patients with renal stone disease and osteoporosis. And important to note is it has less efficacy in patients with CKD or high salt intake and NSAID use. AC inhibitors, now all the different steps of the renal angiotensin aldosterone system have all been addressed and have been used as targets for treatment. AC inhibitors inhibit the angiotensin converting enzyme, converting angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. And these have been found to have multiple beneficial effects in cardiac patients, congestive heart failure, left ventricular failure, anti-reval MI, because it prevents the cardiac remodeling and the permanent changes which may occur in a patient in all these following conditions. And it's been found to have advantages in diabetes and in proteinuric liver disease. And these work synergistically with thiazide diuretics. Significant dose limiting adverse effects would include dry cough and angioedema and hyperkalemia. Other things incidentally to be noted are that they need to be contraindicated in pregnancy, and in some situations they may produce acute kidney injury because of medullary changes in the blood flow. Angiotensin receptor blockers have a similar action, but they specifically act on the angiotensin receptors, the ATR1, ATR2. And multiple trials have showed that these are beneficial in endpoint reduction compared to beta blockers, as well as in comparison to AC inhibitors themselves. These have lesser angioedema and also to some extent a reduction in the dry cough. Important to note there is no advantage in using either AC inhibitors with ARBs because these increase the adverse effects and give no additional benefit. Similarly, there is a direct renin inhibitor, which I'll come to, which again, there has been found to be no additional benefit in adding it when we're already using AC inhibitors or ARBs because it only increases the adverse effects, and all of these have a similar adverse effect profile. Calcium channel blockers are in two groups, the dihydropyridines, non-dihydropyridines. Amlodipine and nifedipine are potent vasodilators, have a more immediate action, may be associated with lower extremity edema. Non-dihydropyridines will cause cardiac conduction slowing. So it causes a negative chronotrophic inotropic defect. And this needs to be kept in mind in patients who may either have a conduction abnormality before or when using beta blockers associated with the same. Because both will cause a reduction in the chronotrophic and inotropic effect, and this may cause bradyarrhythmias. Important to note is diltiazem and verapamil may show a benefit in claudicants and Raynaud's phenomenon. I've already dealt with the broader classes and their adverse effects. The only things I'd like to highlight further would be the ones which I've not dealt with already. Interestingly, the loop diuretics, potassium sparing diuretics, and aldosterone agonists. Loop diuretics generally are said to be more effective in congestive heart failure, kidney disease, and poor urine output because of impaired kidney function. But they need to be kept carefully used in situations where there's hypokalemia and there's a risk of significant volume depletion. Among the aldosterone agonists, spironolactone is associated with multiple associated effects, including gynecomastia, which is not seen with eplerenone. And these are the two aldosterone agonists, while amiloride, triamtrene are the potassium-sparing diuretics acting directly in the collecting tubule. These amiloride may be associated with GI side effects, and triamtrene is also a folate antagonist and cannot be used in pregnancy. Beta blockers may be either cardioselective or non-selective. Generally, these may cause bradycardia, hyperlipidemia, insulin resistance, and bronchospasm in patients either with bronchial asthma or COPD. And they have additional effects in patients who either have atrial fibrillation or congestive heart failure or coronary artery disease. Aliskiren is the renin inhibitor I had mentioned earlier. This has been found to have a similar profile of side effects as the AC inhibitors and should not be used along with the AC inhibitors or ARBs. And the other groups include alpha blockers, central alpha agonists, and vasodilators. All of these have their own advantages, disadvantages, and indications of use. Generally, methyl dopa is the go-to drug in pregnancy-induced hypertension, and clonidine can be used in resistant hypertension and with the chance of rebound hypertension significant. Significant other adverse effects would include hydralazine causing drug-induced lupus, and methyl dopa causing hepatotoxicity and hemolytic anemia. Finally, there are certain emerging therapies which for control of hypertension, which I'd like to go into, which would include carotid sinus baroreceptor stimulation or renal sympathetic radiofrequency ablation. The carotid sinus baroreceptor stimulation include as well as the NEOS system. Presence of leads which are the baroreceptor, stimulation of the same leads to signals sent to the brain, and these subsequently reduce the blood pressure by acting on the vessels, the heart, as well as the kidneys. And this is how the system looked. NEOS is a newer, is a more advanced system of the same, but both work in principle. These have been used and found to have a reduction in the overall blood pressure, but do not reach the required target. So therefore, they are not under general, are not generally applicable. The renal sympathetic RF ablation uses this this RDN Symplicity catheter system. The principle being that the in the adventitia of the renal vessels, the sympathetic innervation can be ablated with radiofrequency probes, and this has been this both inhibits both the afferent as well as the efferent signals to kidneys, therefore having significant reduction in the humoral effects because of sympathetic stimulation in the kidneys, mainly the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Multiple studies have been done regarding the same, where basically the Symplicity 1 and 2 hypertension trial are have shown significant benefit, but these were also company sponsored, and Symplicity 3 hypertension trial used as an open label used by multi-center applicability has not shown a significant benefit. Therefore, in conclusion, I would like to say that be treated, and it has which can, especially our patients who come with peripheral arterial disease do come with significant other comorbid illnesses, and hypertension can cause multiple cardiovascular effects and adverse reactions, and for that reason these need to be treated accordingly. And a general approach is what we would need to have in treating these patients, approaching the with first line therapy and regular BP monitoring and measurement, and controlling the same ends up in better outcomes in pre-op as well as post-op patients. Thank you.